Sabina, you're on.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Sabinia von Gafka, and I want to welcome you all to day 142 of Humanity Rising. Now, Humanity Rising is an initiative of Ubiquity University and 350 partnering organizations from all over the world. And each episode is live streamed on all social media channels and also through our 40+ streaming partners around the world. And for those of you who may be new to Humanity Rising, this platform and live broadcast arose out of the pandemic as an opportunity for people, leaders, catalysts, and so forth to globally come together and share their experiences of what it's like to go through this pandemic. But even more than that, to present solutions and also elaborate around solving issues that are truly challenging the human race, something that we're noticing not least at these times. And during these 142 episodes to date, we've covered an impressive amount of topics with renowned experts, leaders, artists, creatives, catalysts for change. We've dialogued around many different topics, from systemic change to new governance, new financial economic systems, leadership, holistic health, changing mindsets, the US election, to the rising of the consciousness. And Humanity Rising aims to be a catalyst for change, a global platform where inspired action and co-creation is catalyzed and ignited through dialogue and panel sessions. And having hosted many episodes myself together with Jim Garrison, who many of you know, who is the founder of Ubiquity University and the initiator of Humanity Rising, and who has to date hosted every single episode. That is since 5 months ago. Today is on a business trip, therefore I'm doing the whole opening. But it's truly remarkable and impressive to have Jim really host every single episode as eloquently and knowledgeably as he does. And today we have yet an exciting and interesting session with a profound and unique individual, as we have the pleasure to welcome a dialogue with Daniel Ellsberg. Now, Daniel is an economist, a lecturer, a writer, an anti-war activist, a former US military analyst, and author of The Doomsday Machine, Confession of a Nuclear War Planner. And as an anti-war activist for the past 50 years, Daniel Ellsberg is the whistleblower who helped bring an end to the Vietnam War. Just to give you a background, in 1971, Daniel released the Pentagon Papers, a top secret Pentagon study of the Vietnam War, to papers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other newspapers. And this greatly helped to bring an end to the Vietnam War. But Daniel was charged under Espionage, the Act of 1917, with theft and conspiracy, carrying a total maximum sentence of 115 years. However, all charges were dismissed. And since then, Mr. Ellsberg has done extensive studies on nuclear weapons and nuclear policy, and is a strong advocate for patriotic whistleblowing. He's the winner of numerous awards, including the Right Livelihood Award in 2006, where I want to mention the quote that was given, or that was said, for why he received this award, and that was for putting peace and trust first at considerable personal risk and dedicating his life to inspiring others to follow his example. He's also been awarded the Olof Palme Prize in 2018 with a motivation for his profound humanism and exceptional moral courage. Truly a remarkable and courageous individual. And in today's conversation that will be hosted by Cynthia Lazaroff, Daniel Ellsberg will speak about the future of our democracy and why he believes whistleblowing is essential for preserving it. So I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting and insightful conversation. But before we start the conversation, we're going to do what we do every time, every episode on Humanity Rising. And that is just inviting you to 1 minute heart coherence, a 1 minute meditation, just to align ourselves in the presence, in this sacred space, to open our hearts and open our minds for a multitude of perspectives, and just to be here and now. So just 1 minute of inhale and exhale with some music in the background. Thank you for taking that moment of 1 minute meditation and really feeling the energy of all of us who are here, even though it's virtually. And once again, a warm welcome to all of our audiences around the world. And before I hand over the word to Cynthia Lazaroff to commence the dialogue with Daniel Ellsberg, I want to give Cynthia, who also is a remarkable individual, a presentation. So Cynthia is the founder of nuclearwakeupcall.earth and also Women Transforming Our Nuclear Legacy. And she's an award-winning documentary filmmaker and author of Dawn of a New Armageddon, a personal account of the Hawaii missile scare amidst escalating nuclear dangers that was published in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists on Hiroshima Day. And Cynthia is also dedicated to catalyzing the efforts in the US-Russia relations to reduce the nuclear risk and to working with people in Russia and all countries to move towards a world without nuclear weapons. So with that, I hand over the word to Cynthia, who's joining us from Hawaii. So Cynthia, the word is yours.
Thank you so much, Sabinia, for that very warm welcome and for bringing us all together in this beautiful heart space with the meditation. It's very beautiful, and thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm so honored to be here with you and my dear friend Daniel Ellsberg, and with all of you at Humanity Rising today. And I'm deeply grateful to my very old friend Jim Garrison for the gift of Humanity Rising, for convening this sacred circle of people all over the world every day, day after day through this pandemic. It's really such a gift. I'm especially grateful for Humanity Rising and you, Sabinia, and Jim, and all for creating the opportunity to be in this urgent conversation with Daniel today. And Dan, I want to start on a personal note. I want to say something to you that I've never said before, which is that the first time I heard your name, I was 14 years old. It was the moment when Walter Cronkite announced on the CBS Evening News that you were the man, you were the person, you were the one that had released the Pentagon Papers. From the moment I first heard your name, you were a huge inspiration to me, and you became an instant hero for me and for millions of Americans, because at that time, when the war seemed to have no end in sight, you brought a ray of hope that the brutal war and the bloodshed might come to an end. And indeed, as we have heard, you and the Pentagon Papers played a key role in bringing an end to the war. So I just want to say now, in this sacred circle of Humanity Rising, deep bows of gratitude to you for your courage, for risking everything, and for bringing us peace. Thank you, Dan, so much. And as a teenager, I never imagined that grace would bring you into my life, and that 50 years later, I'd be sitting here in a dialogue with you about the future of our democracy, whistleblowing, and nuclear weapons, and that you would become a dear friend and mentor. it was just about 2.5 years ago that you came here to Kauai and we met for the first time. But in that very short time, you have taught me so much about nuclear weapons, about where we've been, where we are now, and where we absolutely must go if we're going to survive. And so I just want to say thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for everything. So grateful to have you with us. And welcome again, warm welcome. So I want to start, Dan, by going back to 1961 with a moment you describe in your book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. You were working as a defense analyst, a consultant to the Pentagon, and you drafted a question that was forwarded to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And it was, quote, if your plans for general nuclear war are carried out, how many people will be killed in the Soviet Union and China? Unquote. Then you were shown a top secret graph marked Joint Chiefs of Staff for the President's eyes only. What inspired you to send them this question, and what did the graph show, and what impact did this have on you?
Good morning, Cynthia. First, I have to say how wonderful it is to be here. And I loved the opening, to think that we were breathing together all over the world in quietness. That's conspiring, actually, breathing together. We're in a conspiracy, I think, to keep this all going, all of it, all over the world, with all its shortcomings and its pains and the oppressions and everything else, and the love and the compassion. But what is at stake is all of that. And the first real inkling that I had that this was happening, that this was all threatened by human decision makers who were choosing a course that put this all in risk, was when I saw the answer from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the question that had been sent to them that I had drafted in the President's name, of how many people we would kill, the Americans, if we carried out our plans, for example, in the defense of Berlin, or some uprising in East Europe, or that had spilled over into West Europe, or an attack on West Europe. If we carried out our plans, which were always for striking preemptively, first, not out of the blue in total premeditated attack like Pearl Harbor, but in response to some incident that our plans, and that was a wide range of circumstances, in which our plans called for us to try to disarm the Soviet Union before they could annihilate us in the course of a war. How many people would be killed in the course of doing that? And you asked why I posed it that way. It was actually in the mistaken belief from friends of mine in the Joint Staff and the Air Staff that the Joint Chiefs had never actually calculated that total. They talked about numbers of military targets killed, maybe industrial capacity destroyed, airfields destroyed, but they were under the impression that they'd never calculated, their bosses had never actually calculated the number killed, but that was wrong. And the graph was a straight line graph, so it's easy for me to remember, even though I didn't keep a copy of it in those pre-Xerox days. I saw it in the White House. Of how many would die almost immediately from blast and radiation and heat, and how many would die additionally as fallout, radioactive coated particles of dust, basically would filter down to the earth and kill people by radioactivity. That was a larger number than over 6 months. The first figure for the immediate deaths in the Soviet Union and China alone, and I have to say, we had no plan for fighting Russia alone, in the mistaken belief that there was still a Sino-Soviet bloc, which actually had begun to crack a couple of years earlier, drifted into a rivalry. But we had no plan for war with Russia alone that did not involve hitting every city in China, along with every city in Russia. And I was trying to change those plans, and basically to embarrass the Joint Chiefs by the fact that I assumed that they would underestimate the number blatantly, and could then put them on the wrong foot bureaucratically by saying you don't know the consequences. That's ridiculous. That it would be only, but that didn't work out. The figure they gave for the immediate deaths was 275 million people, rising to 325 over 6 months from the radioactive fallout. So they did have an answer to that. And so I expanded the question, and a week later we got the answer to a second question. How many people would be killed altogether in the world from our attacks, basically on the Soviet Union and on its satellites in East Europe, its bases? And that added another 100 million in the satellites, which we regarded as captive countries, under occupation, essentially, even though they were nominally independent states in the Warsaw Pact, East Europe. Another 100 over that million in West Europe, our NATO allies then and now, would be killed by fallout from our other attacks in East Europe and the Soviet Union. That's another further 100 million, roughly, but pretty closely. And in areas contiguous to the Soviet Union and China, neutral countries like Afghanistan or Austria, Finland, and in Asia, Japan, more or less an ally of ours, but not nominally so, large parts of India. Another 100 million, as I say, so the total was 600 million people that would be killed by our attacks, or 100 Holocausts. And I thought of that at the time. It was stunningly amazing to think that our Joint Chiefs contemplated and prepared for killing more than 500 million people. The Earth's population at that time was 3 billion. And this alone was a clear underestimate, because it not only didn't allow for the response that we would get from the remaining Soviet forces, which would certainly annihilate West Europe at least at that time, again, with actual warheads, killing them on blast and fire, but it actually didn't allow for fire, which was amazing, because the main effect of the thermonuclear explosions, the H-bomb, would be heat and fire. But that was thought to be too hard to calculate. It depended on weather and the kindling and the geographic conditions somewhat on fire. So it was too hard to calculate, and they didn't calculate it. But if that was put in, clearly the casualties they were talking about involved over 1 billion dead out of a total population in the world of 3 billion. Nearly all of these, virtually all of these, would be in the Northern Hemisphere, because winds from the equator would blow toward the poles and keep the radioactive fallout confined within the Northern Hemisphere where the targets were. But that would nearly annihilate, especially when the Soviets got more ICBMs, which was a few years later in the mid-60s, not only Eurasia, but North America as well. The Northern Hemisphere essentially exterminated. Not every person, but very close to that, 90% perhaps. I saw that as an evil plan that should not exist, even as a conception, but it was far more than that. It was embodied in bombs, planes, airfields, men, rehearsals, plans, operations, ready to go on a moment's notice. The missiles, which grew to be the main part of the force, were designed to be fired out of the ground, out of the silos, within 10 minutes, with the decision being made by officers in command capsules within a minute or two of receiving warning. Two other things entered into that we didn't know at the time. First of all, it was another 23 years, or 22 years, till 1983, which was 37 years ago, that scientists, both in Russia and the US, discovered that the cities serving as kindling for these fires would erupt in firestorms because of the effect of the nuclear weapons setting them off on a large area, and loft in a huge updraft the smoke to the order of hundreds of millions of tons of smoke and soot, toxic smoke, black smoke and soot, into the, not the atmosphere, but the stratosphere, where it wouldn't rain out, and would quickly, by winds in the stratosphere, circulate around the globe, the southern hemisphere as well, blotting out all sunlight. Sunlight from all over the world, but about 70% of the sunlight, creating ice age conditions on the earth, killing all harvests and most vegetation, and starving within a year as supplies ran out in all the countries, about between 90 and 98% of the people on earth. We've been ready to do that since about 1950. In other words, 70 years. The world has been living as hostages, in effect, to a decision by Americans, or now Russians, to carry out a doomsday machine, which may explain itself now that I've gone into all this, an apparatus that has the ability to kill nearly everyone on Earth. All other species, by the way, of large animals, can't adapt the way we can, and they will not have 10% or 1% left. They will go extinct from this. And that has been a possibility, not only more or less continuously, if a false alarming should come, but there have been a number of serious false alarms, as Cynthia experienced, a minor one, actually, that affected only Hawaii a couple of years ago, when the false alert was sent out, making people believe that a missile attack was on the way. But actually, there have been mistaken beliefs at our highest headquarters that a missile attack was on the way a number of times on both sides. And both sides, that is Russia and the US, being prepared to try to disarm the other side and lower the damage in the ensuing war that seemed to be about to erupt. Somewhat, even if the damage remaining was, they thought, terrible, still it would be less than if they struck second. Less, it would be better to strike first than second, terrible as the results might be. That was a delusion. It's been known to be a delusion for a long time. It's been effectively a hoax. There would be no difference at the end of a year, at least, when all the supplies had run out. You would not know which side had gone first or second. It would annihilate everyone. Everyone around the world, in other words, is held hostage to this, starting with the attacking countries, but at war, but in no way limited to them. So this is obviously an outrageous, insane situation made by men who were, to all appearances, almost all men, now some women. Ordinary people, people that I worked with, drank beer with in the evening, but they had made these plans, they were ready to carry them out. So that taught me something about humanity, not just about Americans, and our shortcomings in terms of concern for the consequences, the possible consequences of actions that we take. Consequences that are somewhat uncertain in terms of when you'll take the action. They involve, in the first instance, other people outside ourselves, an attempt to save lives, futile entirely on our side. And they provide profits and jobs and campaign donations in our country. And now that Russia is a capitalist country with the formalities of democracy, the same there, actually, which constitute a kind of vested interest in the status quo of producing these weapons. And both sides are in the process of restoring this doomsday machine, not just restoring it, I mean, but modernizing it, so-called, producing new weapons of all kinds to keep it going. And all of this generally in a cloud of unknowing as far as the world's population is concerned, who know very little about this because of secrecy, supposedly in the interests of national security, actually, as I'm saying, risking, undermining national security radically. and lies and hoaxes. So I'm hoping that humanity will arise, will awaken to these risks. That's why I've been doing what I've been doing for the last 50 years, to try to warn people that this could be changed. And if under current political circumstances is not changing.
Dan, thank you for walking us through the past. Really, it's 60 years since 1961. I mean, and taking us to the present moment. It's really, most people aren't aware that this big challenge, this existential threat, is still with us today. And you've just beautifully articulated how it is and why it is. So the next question I just want to ask you is, you've said that despite the reductions in nuclear arsenals that we've seen since the end of the Cold War, we still have many nuclear weapons, as we know, thousands, about 13,500 about. You've said that an all-out war is, quote, a catastrophe waiting to happen, and that the same nuclear dangers we faced during the Cold War are even greater today. And what I want to know, if you could just say, because you've addressed some of this already, but with all that you know, what are you most worried about now? What keeps you awake at night? What would you say is the thing that worries you the most about the nuclear issue and the nuclear danger?
Well, the false alarms, which have occurred and will occur in the future, are particularly dangerous in periods of suspicion of one side or the other, or both, mutual suspicions in particular, as in the classic Cold War, that keep our minds that the other side may use the weapons it has produced and is ready to use, and that this may be about to happen, say as a result of a small limited war between us, a non-nuclear war, or fear of the other side, mistaken fear that they are about to be attacked and that they determined to preempt. The Russians, for example, came very, very close to this in 1983, where Reagan's discussions of the rhetoric against the evil empire, the Soviets, led, and his preparations for a huge military buildup at that time, led the then Prime Minister, President Andropov, former KGB head of the intelligence, to believe that he was about to be attacked and prepare to preempt. And in that situation, a false alarm did occur, technically, where the warning systems, the satellites systems, believed that they were observing the plumes, the red hot plumes of missiles taking off in America aimed at Russia, and warned the Russians through their computerized systems that they were under attack by first 5 and then 15 or more missiles were on the way. And at this particular warning center, a colonel in charge of it, Petrov, was told by his subordinates to tell his superiors that the war was happening. It was time for them to do what Andropov was prepared to do, and that is preempt that attack by launching his missiles at the remaining US missiles on other targets and get the drop on them after a second. Petrov wasn't sure that was happening and chose to lie to his superiors. Instead of saying, it may be happening, but I'm not sure, he told them, it's not happening. It's a false alarm. He wasn't sure that was true. He was later reprimanded officially, severely, for not having told them the truth of his uncertainty at that time, although in fact it turned out, of course, we're still here. We wouldn't be had he given them the warning that his subordinates or some other one person in his place probably would have sent forward. The larger answer to your question, Cynthia, is that what made that particularly dangerous was the rhetoric and the wartime preparations that were being made largely for economic reasons, really, in our country. The profits, the anti-recession, the jobs that were involved had created a fear on both sides, but on the Russian side specifically, that the US might attack. The reason I mention that in particular is that we're seeing a resuscitation of the Cold War. Suspicions both of Russia and of China, which are with some basis in evidence on both sides. But comparing, for example, Russia's reclaiming Crimea some years ago as being comparable to Hitler's expansionist moves in Europe. Specifically, Hillary Clinton was comparing Putin to Hitler in that respect. And as though he were attempting, let's say, to resuscitate the entire Warsaw Pact and take over East Europe or even West Europe, which was very far from what our intelligence people or common sense really indicated. Let's not rely on common sense, but our best intelligence was that was not at all his intention, and yet it was useful to describe it that way in terms of renewing a new buildup, which under Obama, where Clinton was Secretary of State, amounted to a program of $1 trillion to modernize, quote, the Doomsday Machine, not called that, of course, but our ICBMs and other parts of it. So again, that would contribute to false alarms on the other side, as well as on our side. It's extremely dangerous. We're seeing a similar process right now, this week, today, against another nuclear armed state, China, with our warships being sent into the South China Sea to confront Chinese claims to islands, in some cases man-made islands or other islands, there with the possibility of conflict for the first time really since the Cuban Missile Crisis with another nuclear armed state, which Trump was also threatening early on against North Korea, again, a nuclear armed state. I'm saying we live in a world in which the idea of armed conflict between nuclear armed states should be seen as out of the question, not something to be threatened and prepared for and readied and exercised and rehearsed, but I'm talking about armed conflict that can escalate to this nuclear level, something that threatens everyone on Earth. And even in its smallest forms, like, for instance, North Korea, wouldn't lead probably to the nuclear winter I've described. They don't have enough missiles to do that. They don't have enough cities for us to burn to do that in North Korea. China does, Russia does, of course. So it would be limited, but limited to many millions of deaths and to a world, again, of suspicion and precaution and tyranny. I think democracy would be essentially over once we'd experienced as much as 1 or 2 or 3 American cities destroyed, and North Korea can do that. Not just with ICBMs, but with boats that they can send over to our port cities. So the idea of allowing our president to be talking about fire and fury in conflict with North Korea in an attempt to change the regime in North Korea, which is admittedly, obviously, a tyrannical, oppressive regime, one of the worst in the world, but one armed with nuclear weapons. We should not be in a war with North Korea. And that's why, by the way, they're not going to be quick to give up their nuclear weapons altogether. But the idea of preparing, the regime change idea violently and covertly that Putin feels we've been conducting against Russia for a long time to get rid of him, and he has reason to fear that. This is a mindset and that I see developing, and in both parties to some extent. Vice President-elect Biden has talked about China in very similar terms to Trump, and Trump has 2 months left in which to leave a legacy of committing the world to conflict at some level with China or Iran, not yet a nuclear state, but one again, which where millions of casualties would be left. This is the atmosphere that most worries me. And then, I'll just put subordinate only to that, is the very existence of the intercontinental ballistic missiles on our side, which are vulnerable to Russian attack, preemption, They serve no purpose to us at all. They are a duplication of capabilities we've had for more than 50 years in our submarines, but one that gives the Air Force a role and keeps Lockheed and Raytheon and General Dynamics and Northrop Grumman in profitable business with jobs distributed in almost every district of our country. So there were votes, campaign contributions. This is a military industrial complex very hard to confront or to collapse at all, and which keeps this going. So if there was one thing I would want to change in our military posture with the highest priority, it would be these ICBMs, intercontinental missiles, which serve as the trigger to all-out war, to the Doomsday Machine, basically. Serve as targets, serve as things that we may go first because they are vulnerable in a way that our submarines are not vulnerable. And they should go. And indeed, but they're to do that, it's exactly like the problem with our fossil fuel companies and the climate. It's clear that for the survival of humanity, of civilization, not humanity so much, planet can get quite a bit hotter and there will be some people left in some parts of it, perhaps in the poles, that would now be warmer. But catastrophic for civilization to keep dumping fossil fuel with its carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, warming the planet. In other words, the fossil fuel companies should go out of business in their current form. They should not be making their profits or hiring people to produce more oil or coal and burning it. We've got to find alternatives for that very quickly. But that's where the jobs and the profits are now, and it's very hard to do that. Well, we haven't found a way to do it yet politically. With Trump, who has just not really been elected, despite his claims, was maximizing the profits and the fossil fuel burning in the atmosphere, and maximizing not pretty much the product of the military-industrial complex. That too, in large form, has to go out of business, or to put it another way, change its form of business totally. But very reluctant to do that, and politically able to prevent it. So we have these two conglomerations here of vested interests to keeping the process going exactly as it is. And on the climate side, that means toward a hotter climate, catastrophic consequences. And on the other side, not a daily increase in risk, but a maintenance of risk that's been with us and which so far we've been lucky enough not to have, not to experience the full weight of this readiness for all-out war that we've created. We can't rely on our officials as they are now, dependent as they are on campaign contributions from both of these sources, or think tanks actually that depend precisely on funding from these sources. Raytheon, Lockheed, I'm putting the names here, or Exxon, and Aramco, Chevron, and so forth. On the others, I think we have to become informed ourselves as to what the problem is, where we're standing, and demand with the democracy that we do have left, as we've just seen, though it hasn't been consummated yet, in terms of a change in personnel in the White House. We're still holding our breath on that. But the odds are that we have just removed the man from the White House in charge of this latest great buildup in nuclear weapons and in fossil fuel burning. We haven't replaced him with someone dedicated to radical change by any means. It is better for the better, but it's really a challenge to us and an opportunity, not a change that now takes care of the problem. We have to take care of the problem by redirecting the energies of our leaders and our government. The leaders have to follow us.
Once again, Dan, you've tied so many things together. I just want to reflect back to you. You know, you talked about the intercontinental ballistic missiles and the need to actually get rid of them, and how difficult with the current ICBM lobbying that goes on, and the states that are invested in the corporations that are invested, like the fossil fuel industry. So, and you've come back to elected representatives, and I think that most of us don't realize that these ICBMs are, as you've identified, also the trigger for false alarms. They're the greatest risk for false alarms that could cause an accidental nuclear war that you've identified as a concern as well. So I think it's really important that you've touched on the waking up, and then the communication with the elected representatives, letting them know that this is important to us, letting them know that we're going to modernize the ICBMs. I understand there's like couple $100 billion that are put aside to modernize ICBMs, and it's in the face of a pandemic and climate change and so many other problems. You know, I read recently that we have more nuclear warheads in the United States than hospitals. So with where we are with the pandemic and climate change, can you speak to how one goes about shifting these priorities? We talk about conversion. We talk about things that we create a vision, and we demand that we, you know, have the resources put where they're most needed to serve human needs. Can you address that?
We're spending some nominally over $740 billion a year, which actually excludes many aspects of our military spending, which is better seen as close to $1 trillion a year. That is $1,000 billion a year, most of which makes the world more dangerous and our own country more dangerous as part of that. In other words, far from contributing to national security, it's our major national security problem in military terms. Obviously, climate is also a danger to our survival as a civilization, as a society here. And we've now seen the pandemic, which, bad as it is a warning of future pandemics that could be far more lethal, very much could have the lethality of past some Ebola, for example, or some other diseases, with the ease of spreading, even a greater ease of spreading, let's say, than COVID-19. In other words, worldwide pandemics that could be very much more lethal and are likely to come, just as the Earth is likely to get warmer, as it is going to get warmer as things are going now. Now, one thing that all of these share in common is an aspect of insanity. We can see right in front of our faces the incompetence, one could say, but it's far more than incompetence, the virtual insanity of our dealing with a pandemic at the national level, with the president spewing nonsense about there's no pandemic, or it's about to go away miraculously, or can be cured with things like, what is it, hydroxychloroquine, I forget the name, fantasies, in other words, compared to other countries which have dealt with it very much more efficiently and appropriately, and have led to a far lower death rate. So one can only say that this, we have seen something about our own country in the first instance here, that it's susceptible to fantasies, to hoaxes on a massive scale. Not that everybody agrees with the president, perhaps half the country does not. But in terms of the election, 70 million people, more than that, voted for him to continue these fantasies. And many of them believe what he's saying just because he says it. The same is true on the climate, basically. We have a political party that professes not to believe in climate science and acts as if it didn't believe it, which is, again, despite the day-to-day evidence of the unprecedented fires and droughts and hurricanes that come along. So What I'm really saying is, I'm sorry to add to it, but the same propensity for delusion and for ignoring the risks that we're imposing on the world, ignoring the possible consequences, has been true of the nuclear policy from the beginning. I don't think if you go back even 20 years and 30 and 40, before the climate and the pandemic, people were confronted with absolute incoherence or craziness. They didn't know what was happening in the nuclear era. It was all secrecy, but they didn't have an example of irresponsibility and hoax on the level that we're now seeing in this last year daily of the pandemic and the climate. So it's hard to believe that things could be as inappropriate, let's just say, as mad as they are. I'm hoping, I think possibly the exhibit of that right now, which, and again, more than 75 million or so have perceived voting against Trump's policies, may realize that this is that the warnings that I'm giving might be true. I understand that it's very hard to believe them, that we could be unnecessarily risking the world to this extent. But as I say, there really is no conceivable justification that could meet popular support on a realistic basis for having 1,500 weapons on alert. And if Trump were given his hand, it would be far more than that. That's many times more than would cause nuclear winter if they acted on alert and were actually sent off. And we have other thousands of weapons operational, ready to go, not on alert, and several thousand others that are on the shelf ready to be destroyed, but haven't been, could still be done, some 6,000 or 7,000 weapons altogether, and the Russians have the same. I think we won't go down after 70 years of propaganda about the need to be at least equal to, or as usually the case, superior to the Soviets, or now the Russians. I think it's very hard for us to do what would be to our interest unilaterally, to get rid of the ICBMs while the Russians retained ours. We'd be safer, and the world would be safer if we did that. If we deprived Russian ICBMs of their targets that can be destroyed, our ICBMs. I don't think that's politically feasible. It has to be done, after all this propaganda, together with the Russians. But that's true of all of these problems. The pandemic the coming pandemics, and the current one, the climate problem cannot be dealt with on a national basis alone, nor can the nuclear basis. After we've been told for so long we must have at least parity. There has to be international cooperation, and it has to be with states that are not up to our supposed ideals, or even not up to our standards, even in terms of democracy, like Russia at this moment, and in more China autocratically. We have to collaborate with them and India and the other countries, and along with West Europe and the others, to deal with all these problems internationally. In other words, we have to develop a concern, on the one hand, with the world at large, for population at large, which humans have never been called on to care about that much in the past, in our thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years, if you want to go back. But just looking at the last 5,000 years, let's say, of empire, since Sumer and the Assyrians, no one has had to care about people on the other side of the world. They couldn't affect them. Nothing they did affected them. Now the smoke we put out affects everyone in the world, in the climate. The pandemics we've just seen can, in the world of jet travel and others, can cross in days, weeks from one continent to another. And which we've already seen. To spend our time blaming one country as opposed to collaborating cooperatively to a greater extent than we've ever seen is itself madness and kind of suicide. And this is also true then on the nuclear issue. It is outrageous that India and Pakistan have built up forces with the support of various other people in the world, including ourselves, especially in both cases actually. India and Pakistan both have benefited by American help in various ways to build up forces that as of now could not produce full nuclear winter, only half nuclear winter. Their forces, each over 100 warheads against the other, merely fission warheads so far, not H-bombs, would, it's been calculated, result in smoke in the stratosphere that would starve about 2 billion people, the least nourished in the world. And that means less cared for, or not cared for at all to speak of in the developed world. But it would be 2 billion people, about a third of the Earth's population now. Why should a third of the Earth's population be subject, hostage, to a running conflict of India and Pakistan over Kashmir and over, Muslim, Hindu rival hostilities of various kinds? If we looked at that alone, we would say that can't be accepted. They don't have any right to put us, so many, not us in the rich world so much, but so many in the poorer world at risk. We're hardly in a position to say that, and we're not saying it, because we put the rest of the world much more at risk in the same way. We're guilty of it in the same way. So these things have to be dealt with. We have to develop a kind of species identity that has really never existed. People have thought about it as one human family, but they don't act that way. Humans have not acted that way, and they don't. Could they come to have that awareness that we depend on each other to this extent and we threaten each other to this extent? Well, it's not impossible. There are strong interests that keep in all of these areas, one would say least the pandemic. It's really hard to find motives, interests behind the ferocity of this pandemic in the US. Anybody benefiting so much from it. We have a leader, apparently it's not easy to rationalize in any sense, his denial, his state of denial about this, except to keep the stock market up in a year of his campaign. I don't know if there's any other motive, or even if that, that is among his motives, if he has any other. But it's been enough, and enough for people to obey him, to echo his absurd fantasies in the thing, and for half the country to go along with it, basically, and to regard mask wearing as an infringement on their liberties, in a way that they've come to accept driving on the right as an acceptable infringement on their liberty, and various other things, but masks, no. And thus, more than 100,000 people have died, maybe 200,000 have died, more than would have happened with a more sane, appropriate policy, such as we've seen in many other states of the world. So I'm saying we have to be better than we are and than we have ever been as a country here in addressing these problems and in recognizing concern and the need for collaboration. Is that likely? No, it's not likely. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible. And the stakes, as I say, are everything in all three of these areas. By the way, the one thing that could actually reach the scale of destruction in the short run of nuclear winter would be biological war or a really virulent pandemic of various kinds. Climate doesn't do it quite as fast. Slower death for civilization. But when Einstein said in 46, at the dawn of the nuclear age, the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, save our modes of thinking. and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. Well, we're still drifting, and we haven't managed to hit that iceberg yet by good luck. But I've always thought, is it really thinking alone that's the problem here? And I think not. It's concern for the future, for our own heirs, even our own grandchildren, for the future of the world, for other people, concern, and concern for this kind of species survival and welfare compared to immediate expenditures, losses, setbacks, or investments, basically. All of these problems require government regulation and government spending. Now, for 40 years, since 1980, we've had, especially with Reagan and ever since, and especially in the Republican Party, the notion that government is the problem and that no government spending except for allegedly defense, which isn't defense, it's offense, it's threat, it's risky, dangerous investment, but that is regarded as acceptable and nothing other. I don't think we can solve these problems without redirecting the resources that now go into military production to these genuine problems of climate and what lies, and fossil fuels in general, international collaboration in various places, disease, and beyond that, education, infrastructure. These problems can be met with government spending. It can't be met without it. And the resources are there in the defense budgets of all countries. Ours above all, which is the largest by far in the world, but other countries as well, tremendously misdirecting their resources to means of threatening each other, which should be used for means of living together. So it is not impossible to change that. And that, to me, is the challenge. Is the risk worth taking? In my case, as you said, Cynthia, trying to end just one war and to change the nuclear arms race at that time, I risked 115 years in prison. Was that too much for one life? How could that be, with these stakes? Of course, it's not too much. And of course, it was worthwhile. And in my case, with the help of a lot of other people and a lot of lucky breaks, it actually did have an effect in the end on the Vietnam War. But we have yet to see a real change in either the nuclear arms race or climate. And we haven't yet, this month as we speak, despite the election, we're still facing a rising death rate, a rising number of deaths in society, a rising number of infections of COVID. In other words, we haven't exactly gotten that under control compared to other countries, and they're suffering too, mainly, largely. But we know it can be done. We know how to do it. We know what other countries have done, talking about the pandemic here now. And yes, it could be done in the other ways too. But it has to have, we talk about need for will, but it isn't just a matter of saying, I would prefer this, I favor that. It has to do with action politically and in our own lives, but a demand for change in the policies in government here in a country where we still do have some influence over what happens in the government. Not as much as we think we have, or we're told, or we should have, or our Constitution suggests. We don't have that, especially since World War II, Cold War. But we do have enough to make these changes if we focus them on countering the effect of the corporations and the officials and bureaucrats who benefit from the status quo, from the way things are happening right now. That means taking on a struggle.
Dan, you've come around to what people can do, which I know people really like to hear what they can do, but I want to just reflect back to you, you know, the idea of a species identity that you talked about, planetary identity, species identity, empathy, you know, identifying with the whole and developing that is something that is critical because the challenges that we face, these existential threats of the climate, nuclear, and the pandemic require that identity to actually be solved, which is what you've said. And so that seems to be a critical component. And then awakening to these issues. And then you said, you know, the stakes are everything. And then you talked about redirecting resources, which I just want to say that seems to, that is actually what would give us the resources we need to address these problems. But let's come around to, you talk about demand for change in government. And people really want to hear from you with your wisdom and all you've been through. And I want to leave time for your efforts as a whistleblower and sharing your wisdom there. But can you talk about what you would recommend that everyone here can do? What would be the most important thing they can do to get started, to dismantle the doomsday machine, to get engaged? You know, what kind of thing can people do right now that would be really important to try to move us in the right direction? And maybe you could speak to engagement with elected officials as part of that.
There has never been hearings in Congress, either in the House or Senate, on the actual consequences of our actual war plans. What I was working on in 61, that's 60 years ago. Congress has never informed itself, never demanded that it be informed on what would happen if we carried out those plans, the nature of the plans, what they are providing funding for every year. What would happen if the ICBMs and the sub-launched missiles that they are funding with our tax money actually would happen if they use them to the world on the one hand. I say on the one hand because every country in the world has a right and a need to demand of their own legislatures, if there's any semblance of democracy at all in their countries, which varies, to learn of the US, what the effects would be, to consider these. Many countries are supposedly protected by the US, quote, nuclear umbrella. That is a commitment by the US to use nuclear weapons first in any war that threatened the integrity, any attack on any of the members of NATO, for example. And there are similar agreements with various forms with Japan and Australia, South Korea, Taiwan, various others that have varying degrees of commitment that the US would, in their protection, initiate nuclear war, either with tactical nuclear weapons, short range, or strategic against another nuclear state. There's no case in which it would benefit, in which it would do other than destroy the countries supposedly being protected by these deterrent threats, if the threats were carried out. So a world in which our NATO alliance and these other alliances that I speak of are based on a readiness to initiate nuclear war must change. That legitimizes and demands this huge buildup of forces that we have ever to make it plausible that since we're crazy enough to build these forces, we might be crazy enough to use them to carry out the threat. And that does have an effect, making other side, other possible adversaries careful, lest they provoke this insane reaction by us. So to a certain extent, there is a deterrent effect there at the cost of maintaining a constant risk of civilization as a whole, global civilization being destroyed. Is this necessary. No, there are no, I'll answer that quickly, but not because I haven't thought about it. No, there are no circumstances in the world that exist today that would justify actually implementing, carrying out those commitments. So people can then demand of their representatives, there are the officials, the Congress people, so for people running for Congress, that they come to understand this problem and that they act to change it. And that threats of the kind that we hear made all the time of regime change or of leading to conflict or of actual conflict in various places have to be moved aside in favor of other means of resolving differences. As I've said a number of times, just getting every country in the world has a right to demand that the US not have ICBMs on Avert. And Russia demanded of Russia as well. I think they have to both go down together, actually. Actually, Trump, for whatever reason, claimed at the very beginning of his term to be open to what he called a grand bargain of that kind, a great major disarmament with Russia. And in any case, a collaborative relation with Russia. Why can't we be friendly with Russia? Now, that was sane. Was it just because he was smart that he said that or sane? I think not. That's not the first explanation that comes to mind with him. Probably from very corrupt motives of various kinds. For his friendship with Russia, particularly, that don't seem to exist with Iran or China even. But whatever the motive, that was an appropriate relation to get along and to collaborate with Russia. And for that, he met the almost bipartisan resistance from the establishment, we could say, both in Congress and outside. And that's happening right now. Resistance to his getting out of Afghanistan with military force, or Syria, or Iraq, or Somalia. It would be hard to explain the tenacity with which it's proposed that we end a 19-year-old war, as far as the US is concerned. I can only explain it in terms of this need for the arms buildup, for the money that's being spent there, or the alliance relationships that have been built up exactly on this mad basis, imperial basis. But anyway, it is worth noting that even Trump has had some instincts, for whatever reason, that I think should have been encouraged and instead were opposed and are being opposed. What that means is that this new administration, which we hope will come in 2 months, and hope we must say in these 2 months, and the world must say, no, there must not be attacks on Iran of the kind that President Trump, still president, has discussed in the last week with his military advisors, or attacks with China that would leave the incoming president with with ongoing wars or conflicts too deep to assuage. The world must say no to that. Their officials everywhere in the world must say that must not happen. And then when it comes to Biden, Biden has actually spoken of increasing the defense budget. Now, that's crazy. He talks about the need to deal with cyber war, new facts like that, drones, space war, and various things, as if that needed further spending over the $740 billion or the $1 trillion we're already spending. That's absurd. And to talk about our needs that are not being met for ventilators, for masks and whatnot, for schools, for infrastructure, for bridges, for health in general. To say that we can't afford those, but we can't afford an increased defense budget. Here is good, decent Joe Biden, a very familiar politician, familiarly talking about increasing the defense budget, as Democrats have done since, in particular, Clinton, going back to that. And this is a form, if we were to look back on this, if there was somebody to look back on events, they would be, if they've been smart enough to survive that long, struggling to understand, to imagine how humans could have behaved this way. But that's what we have to understand. We're seeing behavior right now that we didn't foresee and should have, in terms of the split in this country over race and poverty and gender. And we have to understand ourselves better than we have in the past and other countries and work together to change it. Because if we don't change it, it's going down. And that would be too bad. What can one say? There are no words to describe the threats that we're building. We don't have a language because they weren't conceivable before.
Dan, I wanted to make sure we have time for the talking about your experience as a whistleblower, but I just want to sum up what you've just said and thank you again. Try to bring some of this all together for everyone here, that we absolutely, again, to reiterate, need to come together. We need to be wary of rhetoric that's leading us into new Cold Wars that separate us rather than unite us, so that we have to rise above our differences with countries like Russia and China and come together to collaborate on reducing nuclear arsenals, getting rid of ICBMs, freeing up the resources that we need to take care of each other and humanity. So and then also just to come back to the public engagement with their elected officials, that officials need to know that we care about this. With all of the priorities they have on their desks every day, they tell me they need to hear from all of us and so even beginning, like, what are you doing about nuclear dangers? What are you doing about nuclear policy? Where do you stand on this? We need to demand that of them. And that's something that you've really taught me too, is that we really need to hold them accountable. And you've talked about congressional hearings. We need congressional hearings on this issue. We need to call for that. So those are some of the things, just to answer the chat, is really inspiring our elected officials to take this issue seriously, to take the defense budget seriously, to demand that the resources be spent on taking care of what we most need in our country for our people, and not for more military spending on weapons that we don't need. So, Dan, now just in the time that we have left, I want to go back to that moment where you were at a war resistors meeting in 1969. And that was the moment that inspired you to change your life and to copy the Pentagon Papers. So can you talk about that moment, what happened for you there? And then lead us into why you feel whistleblowing is absolutely an essential tool for our democracy now more than ever, and why it's critical, why you think it's important for our moving forward with everything we've been talking about, actually.
In 1969, there was a meeting of the War Resistors League, which was initially started as an organization of conscientious objectors in World War I. In later period, Albert Einstein was its official leader, chairman of it. And CEOs later, generally pacifists, of which I didn't consider myself to be one in terms of absolute pacifism. I thought that our engagement in World War II had been necessary and legitimate and appropriate. And I still think that, actually. Very hard to find that same justification for any of the wars since. But obviously Vietnam and Iraq in particular. But at that time, I found myself hearing a young man who announced that I just become very impressed by it, seen him in other contexts in a 3-day conference, and was thinking of him as one of the best that America had to offer, a young man. I was glad that the people from all over the world, it was an international conference, and there were people from all parts of the world, really, and I was glad that they could see this American young man as an example of our society when I heard him say that he was on his way to prison for non-cooperation with the draft. And that just struck me like an axe practically on my head, as I've sometimes said, splitting my life in two, because it came as a surprise. I didn't know that he was a draft resistor and had not yet been tried. He was up for trial shortly and did go to prison for several years. I visited him in prison at one point to tell him that I was now copying the Pentagon Papers. They weren't called that then, because he had awakened in me the realization that I had the ability to do more than I was then doing, to do something that would both endanger my job and my clearance. It would eliminate my ability to do what I'd been doing for 10 years up to that or more, of working for the government on a classified basis, because I would be in prison, actually a little more of an obstacle, that I thought it would put me in prison for life. And indeed, I did face a sentence later after I visited him for 115 years. But the basic thing was that he had put in my head the question, now what can I do to help shorten this war? Now that, with his example, I'm ready to go to prison. And that example of Gandhian civil disobedience, of massive, because he was joining thousands of others who were resisting in this same fashion. 5,000 or so went to prison, and tens of thousands faced imprisonment in a legal process, actually. So that anti-war movement, which I don't know of having any real counterpart in terms of numbers of civil disobedience against a war, is something we don't pride ourselves on generally and don't recognize, but it changed my life. And it's for that reason that I've joined many other actions, very small actions around the country, to try to put that question in the minds of other people as well, in connection with interventions or wrongful interventions like Iraq, or the nuclear arms race. And I've been arrested probably in the neighborhood of about 90 times now. And basically only to pass on what I've had the good fortune to experience. And that's the example of the idea that you have to be willing to do more than you have done, do something that sets you apart in a stigmatic way to some extent, a willingness to go to jail from your fellow citizens. Moral courage, and like any kind of courage, it's contagious, it's transmittable, but it consists in ability really to risk ostracism, of losing your job, which is enough in the case of the government people who do it, which is enough to keep nearly all of them from doing it, from exposing things that they know are wrong or criminal or dangerous. That's happening right now, of course. There are some leaks of the president's plans right now, or readiness, let's say, to start wars with Iran or China, but not nearly what could be done in the way of revealing the documents in those plans and making that vivid and trying to bring public awareness to them that will stop these dangerous actions. So there isn't enough of it. There is some, though, and there should be a lot more of people ready, like Chelsea Manning or Ed Snowden, even on a large scale. And Snowden has suffered probably permanent exile, Chelsea Manning spent 7.5 years in prison as a result of her exposing war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, and Snowden for exposing massive surveillance that was clearly unconstitutional and illegal, and has been held so by a federal court at this point, but he still faces prosecution for that. Julian Assange, who facilitated in the way of a publisher, Chelsea Manning's, he's been in prison now for years, facing extradition to the United States. So the costs, the personal costs, are likely to be very great if your identity is known, if it's not anonymous, and sometimes it can't be. The costs are great, and the chance of actually making a change is not large, but it's not zero, and the stakes are just like incalculable. The end of democracy altogether with the police state facilitated by the surveillance that Snowden exposed. The wars that Chelsea Manning exposed in Iraq, which have led in Afghanistan and elsewhere, which have led to 37 million refugees. Climate is going to result in far more refugees, and we can already see what the effect of 1 million in Europe has done in threatening democracy there. And here, even, small number, relatively small number of illegal so-called immigrants, undocumented immigrants, creates in half of our population a willingness really to discard basic aspects of our democracy, Constitution. So I think that without more knowledge of what we are doing in the world and how many people are being victimized or risked by doing that is essential. It may not change anything, but I don't see change happening without that. So people have to take the risk of, on the one hand, bringing out information that's wrongfully withheld, whistleblowing, and on the other hand, acting politically on it at the risk of elections and jobs in Congress. Look at the behavior. I won't even characterize it further. Think of the behavior of the Republicans in Congress faced with, on the one hand, lies that are killing people by their party's president in the White House, their unwillingness to even expose that or disagree with it, except for a handful of exceptions, honorable exceptions, for fear of losing their jobs in election by a minority or not such a minority who follow the president's hoax and demand that the Republicans bend to that. Well, we're seeing an example, in other words, of servility and cowardice here, the opposite of moral courage, that is in front of our eyes. It's unmistakable. It goes beyond what we've experienced as partisan loyalty to a kind of abject servility that's would have been hard to predict.
Dan, we lost your sound. I think you're muted.
Can't hear me?
Now we can. Now we can hear you.
Okay. I don't know what the problem is. Okay, I'm saying the Biden administration, so far in what Biden has said and what appointments he's considering or admitting, seems to be returning to the Obama administration, which he served in as vice president, which is far, far better than what we've had for the last 4 years and far from adequate to the challenges we're facing. The climate policies, let's say, of Obama, Biden has, under pressure from Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has actually adopted a climate plan that is, in its scope, scale, fairly appropriate, about $2 trillion over time, but largely badly allocated. by the opinions of climate scientists and economists, in terms of emphasizing corporate measures like carbon capture, which are still conjectural. They're technical fixes that lie in the future at best and will not solve the problem. So, or carbon taxes that are very inadequate to do anything. In other words, it's still up to us. Our efforts in America don't change with this election. They begin in a way because we have an opportunity to influence this administration that did not exist with the Trump administration, civility. But that will only benefit anyone if we act on those possibilities, which is some of us, I think, of course, choose to act as if we had a chance. And we do. No one can say this is impossible. But it's not only not guaranteed, we have to understand, if we understand reality, it's an uphill struggle. It's difficult, far from even likely to succeed, but possible. That's what I say over and over again.
Well, Dan, I just want to thank you for sharing your insight and wisdom and the idea that we have to be better than we are and we have ever been, and that we act as though we have a chance, that it's possible, that you keep saying that it's possible and we have a chance, but we have to be vigilant and realize how much work we have to do to actually turn things around. And so thank you for illuminating all of these different areas today. Sabinia, wanted to welcome you back. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. It's been such an honor to have you with us and all of you at Humanity Rising. And Sabinia, thank you.
It's a wonderful opportunity to speak to your organization, which spans the world, and to realize that this is the new concern for all of us that we have to act on in a way that humans were never called on to do before. Not just us against them, but us, all of us, all together.
All together.
All together in
Love
unity.
you. We love you.
Definitely.
Thank you.
And I just want to echo Cynthia and say, Daniel Ellsberg, I mean, on behalf of myself, Humanity Rising, and I know all the people in the chat and all of our audience, just expressing such an immense gratitude for not only you sharing your story, your profound knowledge, your wisdom, but your courage to holding, truth to power, your moral compass, and your extraordinary courage and accomplishments. And also, a deep gratitude for your steadfast dedication to not only revealing the truth, but also really trying to empower us and all others and educating us on the necessity of how we really need to step up and raise our voices and also hold, the people in power accountable, because this is our world and we are the people who need to also step up. And I think having people like yourselves who are proof of the courage and the willpower and of really walking the talk is a necessity in this time, because people need leaders who can pave the way and also show that, you said, courage is contagious. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us here today and share your wisdom. And I really will make all our efforts to echo this out, not least to our audience, but beyond. So with that, I just want to say, stay safe and healthy. And also, Cynthia, thank you for so eloquently and engagingly, hosting this conversation with both relevant questions and insights, and for all the work that you do as we're talking about nuclear threat and so forth, because you're engaged in this too. And of course, to our audience who are sending in so many questions and also initiating peace constellations, and the work is already in the flow, which is amazing to see. That's why I'm so proud of Humanity Rising, because we have people who, really go to direction and incentivize and really try to walk the talk. And that is why we have Humanity Rising to really facilitate those kinds of initiatives. And I hope you've all enjoyed this. And of course, you can watch this recording again because there was so much profound knowledge that was conveyed. So you can watch that on the different social medias. I just also want to mention that tomorrow we have a session. We're going to talk about the art of grief and the need for community and ritual, especially at this time of collective anguish. We need to turn to the healing power of also ritual and art. So please join us tomorrow, 5 p.m. Central European time. And once again, a profound and immense thank you to Daniel and Cynthia and to all of you who have joined us. I hope to see you tomorrow. Stay safe and healthy.